Okay, so we're back with Professor Alaric Searle, who's an expert on the history of armoured warfare. Some of you may have seen our previous podcast, I suppose we call it, on day one of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We're now at day 58 and thought it was a good idea to have a recap and see what we got right, what we got wrong, and what the situation on the ground is.
Yeah, I think it's actually a good point to start going back to a previous podcast. So there's two things which I'd just like to home in on. The first one is I think I kicked off by saying that this is worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I don't see any reason to revise that judgment.
Yeah.
Quite simply because it's not a sort of brinkmanship, is somebody going to hit the nuclear button or not? But it's a sort of simmering conflict. So many things are unclear. It seems to me that Putin just doesn't want to give up in the face of reality staring him in the face. So the capacity for this conflict to escalate into something much bigger, either in military terms or in terms of general economic meltdown across the world, is quite clearly still there. So I don't think I got anything wrong with that statement.
Yeah.
The statement that probably people are going to have homed in on is my prediction that the Russians would take 4 to 6 weeks to occupy the whole of Ukraine.
Yeah.
Now, of course, I should have perhaps qualified that statement because it was based on various assumptions, which, of course, we had no way then of knowing whether they would come true or not. So. Yeah. My initial assumption was, well, first of all, there is no way that Russia could take over the country in a week. That's just nonsense. What I was, I suppose, assuming was that the Russians wouldn't undertake this kind of operation without the capacity to achieve air superiority in the first 2 or 3 days.
Yeah.
And generally, you thought that, well, why on earth would you do that without air superiority, given the size of the country? So that's kind of, I suppose, where the error lay. I think as well, we didn't really understand how good the Ukrainians have become.
Yes, or how bad the Russians would be, to be honest.
Or how bad the Russians would be, yeah. Even though the Russian incompetence just has a very familiar feel to it, if you know anything about Russian military history.
Yeah.
And also how the leadership is disconnected from, the military on the ground. I suppose the other thing is, if you were to play the what ifs, so the descent operation on Hostomel Airport, if that had come off, if the Ukrainians hadn't managed to pull the chestnuts out of the fire, would the conflict perhaps have panned out in a very different way? So again, these are the sort of what ifs. So that's obviously the problem of prediction, that things can go in all kinds of different directions. You just don't know.
That's it. And I must admit, because we've talked briefly before we started recording about the actual VDV operation at Hostomel. And we were saying that the paratroopers, they got a lot of stick because of the amount of casualties they took and how the operation went badly wrong. And they ended up getting wiped out effectively. In effect, though, they pulled off their operational side quite well. It was the whole strategic plan that was completely built on foundations of sand. The Russian high command, as you say, I think you're right. I think Putin was massively incorrect on his assumptions and the Russian intelligence assumptions on how the Ukrainians would react. I don't think they expected anything like the sort of resistance they got. And that's why they launched the operation in the first place.
I think that Putin's error has really come down to the fact he's been driven by an ideology of Greater Russia rather than any sort of proper military calculation. We can maybe talk about that a bit later.
Yeah.
Just to sort of round off the Hostomel airport action, the way I see this is a lot of the Russian actions, and this one in particular, just reek of Soviet era concepts. So this looked to me like another sort of Soviet idea of the descent operation.
Yeah.
You descend from the skies, achieve surprise, try and pull off a sort of Eben Emil 1940 type operation. But I think the actual Russian approach when it came to descent operations was that you would send in loads of people to different places, particularly bridges, if we're talking about NATO's Central Front, mid-80s or mid-70s Cold War situation. And if you're a Russian commander, you're going to lose at least half of them.
Yeah.
You just hope that enough of these sort of daring bridge seizing operations come off, or enough of the airport seizing operations come off, that it's worth the losses you're going to take. So this thing, again, as you say, built on sand, you're trying one descent operation. If it goes wrong, then your plan starts to unravel.
Yeah. I say, I think the comparison with Market Garden stands to the extent of they expected enough disruption to be caused in the Ukrainian rear area that their armoured forces would then move up and relieve them. I'm sure that was the plan, but obviously badly miscalculated the level of resistance they were going to meet, certainly in the north of the country around Kiev. So,
yeah, and I mean the way in which the Russian sort of armored thrust, in inverted commas, cue the canned laughter, unraveled, is in a way, when you actually see it unfolding, is very, very understandable. So you've got military commanders who Putin stares at directly in the eye and says, "You can do this in 5 days, can't you?"
Yeah.
Yes. Of course, you can't say no to Putin, and
Well, you
they
can.
must.
You're going to fall
Well,
out of
yeah,
a window.
yeah. So the extent of the logistical problems. So
Yeah.
tires are not inflated often enough and then burst.
Yeah.
No proper logistic planning, quite clearly because they weren't prepared for the operation.
Yeah.
And that kind of operation on that kind of scale, you've got to exercise that for, I would say, at least 6 months to get any kind of competence into it. And of course, there's the old Russian problem of people selling off equipment.
Yeah.
To try
So
and make ends meet.
we have a systemic problem in Russia, which is, I think it was there in the Soviet time. I think it might be worse now because, let's face facts, Russians are basically a kleptocracy. That's why you have all these oligarchs with their yachts around the world. Well, that's where the money's gone.
And it infects the whole system, of
Yeah,
course.
it does.
So
Yeah.
if you're a sergeant, you're going to steal
Yeah.
your corporal's money because you've got to make ends meet.
Yeah, or you're going to sell the tires on the black market, or
Yeah.
strip off whatever parts you can for copper wiring or whatever. Of course, and it goes all the way from top to bottom. Well, if that's the system you're building, of course it's going to break down when you put any sort of pressure on it, and that's exactly what they've done. So I think what he's done is believe his own hype. I mean, to be fair, I believe the hype. I apologize to Ukrainians. I had some outraged people a little while ago saying, when are you going to apologize for saying 3 to 4 weeks for the collapse? I was definitely wrong on that. Yeah. But I think it was widespread thinking that Ukraine wasn't up to that sort of standard, and the Russians were, whereas in fact the inverse is true.
And of course, it's very much problems of prediction because we didn't know what the Ukrainian battle plan was.
No.
Again, there's a lot of commentators standing in front of maps in TV studios, and basically they're guessing.
Yeah.
They don't have the information really to make some of the predictions that they're making. But I mean, we've now got, we're over 50 days into the war, not a special military operation. It's a war.
Yeah.
And
it's an aggressive invasion. That's what it is.
It's a genocidal invasion, I would say. So if we just go through the sort of key military events, the sort of standout ones. So we've dealt with Hostomel Airport, a great sort of improvised defensive operation by the Ukrainians. The defense of Mariupol is an interesting one. So I don't know whether it's fallen yet.
The steelworks, the Azov, they're still holding out as of this morning. I know, and I know yesterday Putin announced that they're going to besiege it. They're not going to send their guys in, which is the wise move, quite frankly. But also, I think a telling indication of how bad their manpower situation is, that they can't afford a victory they desperately want. But it would be far too Pyrrhic, I think, at the moment.
I mean, I suppose the big military question is the length of time that Mariupol has held out. Will that, in the long term, prove to be quite significant, or not? Again, what we don't know is the extent of Russian losses in Mariupol, or the extent of Ukrainian losses. I mean, the Azov battalion, I think, was very good at chucking the Russians out in 2014. They just proved to be militarily much more efficient than the Ukrainian army as it was then. I suppose that makes this a really important one for Putin.
Yes.
He doesn't want not to be able to capture Mariupol. I mean, this is driving him nuts, I would say. The other two big military events, I would say, first of all, thinking of the Moscow battleship.
Yes, yeah.
That's going to have driven Putin crazy. And I suppose the reason why it's significant is there's two reasons. First of all, the significance of the Black Sea area and the importance of Odessa to Ukraine. And secondly, obviously, the fact that Ukrainians have been able to develop a missile which can sink the Russians' biggest battleship.
Yes, yeah.
So, I mean, if you're the Russians, then you're going to think, well, what else have they developed that they've got up their sleeves?
Well, yeah, certainly. I mean, the whole Black Sea fleet very noticeably started sailing much further away from the coastline after Moscow got sunk. So that will put a dent in any potential plans they had for amphibious operations, which was been threatened from day one. Yeah, we're seeing a lot of surprises in this war, although perhaps they shouldn't be surprising. A
Yeah.
lot of what we're seeing has already taken place in other wars.
Yeah.
I know a lot of the things that are happening, for example, the use of UAVs is really getting trumpeted. That all happened back in the Azerbaijan-Armenian war in 2020. Just this is on a much bigger scale.
Yeah, and it's obviously a war with much wider implications.
Yes.
This isn't a sort of local border conflict. It's something much, much bigger.
Yeah.
Just to round off the sort of big flashing lights in terms of military situation, it's obviously successful defense of Kiev was a huge success.
Significant, very, very significant, yeah.
And again, it would be very interesting to get some accurate statistics on
Yes.
On Ukrainian and Russian losses. Obviously, the Ukrainians are not going to release that information, and nor should they.
No. I mean, at the moment, I think the borderline figures are 20 to 21,000 Russian dead and probably 60,000 wounded. That's what I'm seeing. How accurate it is, I don't know. The Ukrainians, I think, have said they've had 3,000 dead, but that's generally considered them being on the low side. And as you say, they're not going to be open about what they've lost. But what we've seen essentially, certainly around Kyiv, is, and again, it's nothing revolutionary. It's what happens when you have a motivated, well-equipped, and competent defensive force against an incompetent and ill-equipped offensive force. There's nothing new.
Motivated.
Yeah, exactly. There's nothing new in these lessons here. This is what happens. So obviously now we need to see how that pans out on the eastern offensives, which are now developing, which seems to be the next theatre of interest.
I mean, before we get to the sort of the if you like, the big strategic operational picture, if we could just sort of go into the takeaways in terms of technology. Again, I mean, I wouldn't regard myself as a particularly qualified or informed expert in technology. I mean, I suppose what a professor of history has to offer is how all the moving parts fit together.
Yes, yeah.
And how we should view the conflict. But obviously we have to look at some of the big takeaways in terms of technology. So again, you probably need some sort of qualified analyst to go through the footage we've got, because I'm not always sure what I'm seeing from a drone and a tank blows up. What weapons has it been hit by? Has it been hit by artillery? Has it been hit by a drone like Switchblade, or what's actually hit it? Has been hit from the air. But I think what we can say is that NLAW is a really good weapon against a T-72.
Yes, that seems to be.
I mean, it just blows it to bits.
Yeah.
Turret gone, and it shows as well the T-72 is actually a pretty awful design.
Yeah, I think this is it's no secret that Russian tank design has always it's a Soviet hangover, which was they fully expected you lose a tank, you're probably going to lose a crew. You have more tank, you have more crew. That worked in the Soviet days where they had a bigger population pool and were using conscript armies. The current Russian army is not that. They're using the same doctrine. They are not equipped to deal with that level of casualty now. They're a much smaller force, especially the amount of forces they actually tried to use in the Ukrainian operation, which, I mean, I remember you said it before, you were baffled that they were saying, I think the estimate's 190,000. And you said then, well, even if they take Ukraine, how are they going to control it? That's not enough men.
Yeah.
Well, it now turns out they're actually probably overmanned by the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians have brought in much wider call-up and call-up reservists and conscription. And the figures I'm seeing are like maybe 300,000 men in the combat units. They outmanned the Russians. And again, morale's much higher. They're fighting for their homes. And equipment-wise, they're still getting supplies in from the West. They've still got their own stuff. So it's swinging in their favour at the moment, I say, in favour of the Ukrainians.
I mean, I would say as a defensive force, they are definitely superior.
Yes.
The big question is, can they actually get mobile forces together?
Yeah.
Again, to what extent can they have enough air defense to launch any kind of mobile counterattack?
And this is the whole point of Zelensky's appeals, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, Ukraine is almost like a sort of sponge, just soaking up Russian forces and gradually slicing them up into small pieces.
Yeah.
And I think they have learned from some of the mistakes they made in 2014. Classic error in mechanized warfare. Forces too far forward, they get broken through and then surrounded. So they've basically fought a very good, if you like, sort of fighting retreat, gradually sapping the Russian strength to the point where they were able to push them back, particularly around Kyiv. I mean, the other two takeaways I would would raise in terms of technology. First, use of drones, not just by the Ukrainian soldiers, but also by citizens flying the drones and saying, "Oh, look, I found artillery piece and 2 trucks and a T-72 in this forest," and then bang, they're gone.
Yeah. The accuracy that the drones allow, especially on artillery fire, has been kind of shocking. And you say the sheer prevalence of them is what's new. I mean, they're using them down, I think, to like effectively company, possibly even platoon level to call in this stuff. And you say you have civilian operators using them, guerrilla forces using them. Again, like the use of drones for spotting and as offensive weapons is certainly no surprise to me, I must admit. It's been around for the last 5 years at least. Certainly ISIS were great exponents of it, and it's being used more and more by anti-government and guerrilla forces all over the world. So the use of them by effectively, I say it's like the modern day what was the Franco-Prussian War, the French guerrillas. It's kind of like that. Yeah, the Franc it's like that 2021, 2022. It's the modern day equivalent of that, I think.
And obviously it puts a new spin on the propaganda value of having a picture of a burning tank.
Yes.
If you can broadcast the Russians, "Oh, look, here's a Russian tank column being pulled apart," that's not going to do their morale much good.
No.
And clearly Ukrainians have been very good in terms of propaganda.
Oh, yes, absolutely, yeah. I mean, this is why you have to be very careful dealing with the information coming out of both sides. They're both playing their hand as best they can. I think the Ukrainians are acknowledged to be winning the propaganda war. The Russians don't seem to be doing that very well either, to be honest.
I think, obviously, we're on the Ukraine side because this is a democracy versus an evil dictatorship that has got no time not only for the Ukrainians, but doesn't care about its own people.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think have to be careful. Obviously, there's casualty statistics. I would take the Ukrainians' casualty statistics and at least double them.
Oh, at least, yeah.
And their estimations of Russian dead, I would probably take the NATO figure and pick the number in between.
Yeah. That seems like a fair assessment. Yeah.
Yeah. When it comes to some of the sort of recorded conversations between Russian soldier and mother, I have heard it said that some of the voices seem to be who are speaking Russian are speaking with the Ukrainian accent. So I wouldn't discount all of them, but I wouldn't take them all absolutely at face value.
No, absolutely, yeah. As I say, both sides are battling. You could even say both are battling for existence, because if Russia doesn't achieve whatever their goals are now, which seem to be changing daily, it's a serious blow for them, and it's certainly a dangerous blow for Putin, which is, quite frankly, I think a lot of this war's about. Most of this war's about. It's about him.
Yeah. So I mean, do you think there's any other technology takeaways that you would point towards? I mean, I've already mentioned the sinking of the Moskva. I mean, that's a biggie.
The thing is to say, I don't think there's anything particularly new happening in the Ukraine. The scale, yes, but as we've said before, the tank is dead. Well, we've heard that before in every war ever fought. Oh, look, anti-tank weapons do their job. Well, there's a surprise. Surface warships are dead. Well, we've heard that before as well. Oh, look, what was it? Oh, close air support is dead. Well, yeah, heard that one before as well. That's the whole point of combined arms warfare. It's a team game.
Yeah.
If one of your elements isn't working, that benefits the opposition. That doesn't mean it doesn't work. It means your particular concept or doctrine doesn't work.
Yeah, and I think the Ukrainian use of anti-tank weapons, clearly some of the prepared positions that they've used at sort of crossroads, hidden in among trees, there's a fair amount of planning has gone into that. Yeah. And they've obviously been trained by, certainly the British. I would presume that the Americans were also training them last year in the use of anti-tank weapons.
Yeah.
So they know what they're doing.
That's it. And of course, there are the benefits of 8 years of conflict in Donbass. I think they've learned their lessons and the Russians haven't, or the Russians have taken the wrong lessons. Yeah, I mean, but there's nothing particularly new to be learned there, I don't think, because, as I said, it's the same old thing, combined arms warfare. It's the same old story back to 1919, basically, 1918.
I think as well, the experience that troops have gained in the Donbass, if you've called up reservists who've got minimal training, and even just citizens, if you've got, say, a platoon and there's 2 people that have fought in the Donbass, they act as a kind of, it's been called a sort of corset function. So if you've got experienced troops, they will pull together and mold a unit of inexperienced troops.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And if you spread your experienced troops throughout your units, then it's learning by doing. If you don't get it right, you're probably dead. But if you've got experienced people, young recruits will look to them for the lead.
Yeah.
And that's obviously strengthened their armed forces in a way that the Russians seem to have a pretty weak force with very poor training.
Yeah. And of course, the other thing the Ukrainians have had in their advantage is the sheer quantity, and it's a logistics question, the sheer quantity of defensive anti-tank weapons they've had available to them. We talked about the NLAWs, and the Javelins get a lot of attention, but the Eastern Europeans have been flooding the place with RPGs. There's been a whole bunch of stuff sent, and this is all very effective if you use it correctly. And that's what the Ukrainians have been doing.
And I mean, the anti-tank weapons are not simply there to take out T-72s. You've got wheeled logistics vehicles. You've got BMP-1s, which are just hit it with an RPG
traps.
and it's gone.
Yeah, no, I'm not a fan of the BMP-1, having used them. They're not fun.
Well, I mean, they're probably the vehicle which has had the highest losses for very obvious reasons, because it's not designed for urban warfare or anything else. It's certainly there to flood NATO's defences in 1985.
Again, it's an attritional weapon. You don't want to be running 30 of them down a single track road. You want to be hitting 500 of them, smack into the enemy tank division and overrun them, and keep going. And this is it. The Russians say doctrine equipment was designed for a previous war which never occurred. Interestingly, I saw talking about that. The problems I think we're going to get now as well is the logistical support for the Ukrainians from the West, because I think a lot of our stuff has been used up. And I think this is one of the problems we get with the calls for heavy weapons. It's just how much does NATO countries or the Western countries actually have available? Because of the decline in defense budgets over the last 30 years, most countries don't have a lot of stuff on hand for their own forces, I think, generally, let alone supplying them. And I saw a comment 3 weeks in where the Ukrainians started saying, well, we need more NLAWs, but we need them now. And a lot of comments were, well, basically NATO prepares for a 3-week war, and that's what we've had, and that's why it's running out. A lot of this expenditure is burned through the stocks.
I mean, I think if you're Ukrainians and trying to create some sort of mobile sort of battalion level armored force, if you could just get 4 Leopards or 4 M1s and then mix them in with T-72s, you could probably create something which might function in an offensive capacity, but you would need to train to get it right. I mean, we know from history that tank infantry coordination, it doesn't matter what year you're in, it's always difficult.
I mean, I even think that it's given the disparity apparently between the Ukrainians and the Russians, I need to say it's difficult to judge because we have no real evidence of how the Ukrainians are conducting their combined arms ops. They could probably get away with using the older stuff. It's generally, I think it's one of the lessons you get from the Israelis, effectively. A motivated, well-tried, competent side, even if their equipment is inferior, should be a better side. So, certainly if they get better equipment, that would count.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about the military situation, as far as I can see, the Russians are just going to try and bludgeon their way through. It could go horribly wrong, of course. And it's particularly the case with politicians. If they see numbers of tanks, they think this equals, we will succeed. And Putin's apparent lack of willingness to listen to people. I mean, I think it was the head of the Russian central bank was telling him, look, we can't sustain this any longer. And he just basically ended the conversation. Didn't want to hear it. So if he behaves like that in the military realm, then he could just basically use up all his armor in useless frontal assaults. The big question to me is, can the Russian army defend against the Ukrainian attack? And what would the Ukrainians need to eject the Russians from at least part of Donbass? And if we're trying to find, if you like, sort of parallels in military history, I mean, it just jumped into my head the idea of the Iran-Iraq war, where things were, you had people not very good at using armored forces. Dictatorships are normally a terrible place to have armored forces because you need to allow initiative. And the Russians have no initiative because you just have to follow orders, however crazy. So, could the Ukrainians actually eject the Russians from the Donbass? I'm not too sure. I think they might be better just trying to hold them. And if they want to launch an offensive, try and get them out of Kherson. Because they would be in a much better position to protect Odessa, which they've got to hold. And they don't want to let the Russians anywhere near Odessa, I would say. So that if I was, chief of the Ukrainian General Staff, I would be looking at, an offensive operation in Kherson. However, of course, the Russians can resupply from Crimea.
Yes.
That said, with the sinking of the Moskva, it might be a little bit harder. And if they're trying to to run things through Mariupol, through that corridor, maybe air power, artillery forces, that the Ukrainians need to try and squeeze them in that area.
Yeah.
And Kherson is also an area where the population really don't want the Russians there. So I think in military terms, that might be, the way forward. I mean, obviously, neither side really wants to give up at this moment. Putin doesn't want to give up.
No.
The Ukrainians don't want to give up to, an attempt to sort of destroy the country. So, is it going to be like sort of other wars where things just grind on and on and on until both sides are basically exhausted? Which is why I thought that the Iran-Iraq war of 80 to 88 might be a useful sort of point of orientation. At some point, one of them's going to have to give up. But of course, if we think back to the Iran-Iraq war, there was an offensive by the Iraqis, which finally broke the Iranians, who just drained the manpower. Over the course of 8 years.
This is it. And the thing is to say, like, Russia at the moment hasn't properly mobilized. They're still trying to use largely the contract army. They're bringing in Wagner forces who have apparently lost huge casualties. And there's this talk about Syrians, and they're bringing in people like the Chechens in. It becomes a question of, can the Russians sustain the level of casualties they're taking with these forces, or will they have to mobilize conscripts? Now, if they do, then you've got a whole other issue of, are these guys going to be up to it? How do they equip them? They seem to be struggling to equip the ones they have already. I think in that way, this is a game that favors Ukrainians. And I think the next few weeks will actually be significant. Depending on what happens in the Russians' eastern offensives, they're trying to cut off a pocket at the moment. If they can pull it off, that would be bad for the Ukrainians, but they haven't so far. I think that's going to eat them up personally. But,
yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think as well, a lot of the press commentators are fixating on the 9th of May.
Yeah.
And I think that's a bit of a mistake, actually, because if you're in a dictatorship which controls all the media, you can just make up something and say, great victory, hand out lots of medals to people that allegedly fought in Mariupol and conquered the city. I'm not sure that the Russians are in a position where they can pull off something between now and the 9th of May, unless they use tactical nuclear weapons or have some absolutely massive artillery assault.
Yeah, I mean, they're desperately they're using artillery heavily already. Although it seems to be mainly on city smashing. That's what they're. I think that says more about their capabilities than anything, that they haven't to go for like area targets like that. I also think it's part of their strategy to really just bring Ukraine down. Like inflicting casualties and damage on the civilians. That's a long-term goal, if you like.
And I think this is, with all the sort of commentators standing in front of a map explaining military things, I think we're losing sight of the genocidal aspects of this war
sheer horror
from Putin.
Of it,
There has been some reports coming out of people from Ukrainian universities being deported, arrested. To me, it looks like Putin really would just like to destroy Ukraine as a nation.
Yeah.
So there's deportations from some of the eastern, regions to Russia, and it raises, of course, the whole question of war crimes. Which I think is useful to look at. So Bucha, obviously, in a way, a public relations coup for the Ukrainians. It's not the only place where civilians have been killed. The question is, was this an order from above, or did it just kind of happen? So I think we've got to differentiate here between the different kinds of crimes. So to me, the forces trying to break through to Kiev, taking horrible losses, terrible logistics, not enough food. It looks very suspiciously like some of the German crimes in the Second World War in Russia. So where you have a commander who's fanatical and is actually sanctioning it, or almost tacitly encouraging it, saying, well, okay, I don't care how many of them you kill. I'm going to look the other way. Again, it's a common theme in 20th century warfare. So My Lai massacre, an out-of-control sergeant just decided he hated, the Vietnamese and would kill as many as he could. So to me, the numbers involved are sort of an occupation period of a few weeks. They're running out of food. To me, that looks like either a breakdown in discipline, a commander sanctioning it, and possibly the people either looking the other way or encouraging them, heads full of propaganda about how awful the Ukrainians are. I can't imagine that we're going to find any orders from above saying kill civilians. That said, if you look at some of the other things going on, so an attempt to try and go after the Ukrainian intelligentsia, deportations from the eastern regions which the Russians have occupied, that to me looks like very much a deliberate policy, particularly around cities that the Russians want to control. Arresting mayors. So I think it's the crimes are in a way sort of two different kinds of crimes. The ones committed by out of control soldiers are just, I would say, motivated by Putin's ideology, but breakdown in discipline.
Mm-hmm.
The other ones are quite clearly systematic. There was a cyber attack on Ukrainian universities in the opening day of the conflict, which hasn't really been picked up on in the Western media.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the kinds of things which I think we should be concerned about, because it does make perfectly clear that Putin would just basically like to render Ukraine non-functioning as a state.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think that's why you're seeing such systematic attacks now. Once the drive on Kyiv miscarried, it very much swung to attacking city areas, just bombardment, hitting civilian areas. This is deliberate policy, I'm sure of it. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of war crimes, the trouble with, we can all, it's the usual. And I've been across enough war zones and seen enough war crimes to know that normally no one gets held to account. And I suspect that's what's going to happen here. The only thing that may happen is if you get a actual collapse of the regime in Russia. That's the big what if, and everyone's been talking about it since day one. I won't go counting on that personally.
I mean, that said, I think there's still a point in actually documenting the crimes.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Making it clear they've happened, because in terms of the propaganda war and the West maintaining the moral high ground, I think this is absolutely crucial because it communicates in a very clear way to populations across Europe just how awful Putin's regime actually is.
Yeah.
And that needs to be kept very much in the forefront of people's minds.
Well,
because if Russia can be defeated, it's only going to happen if Western populations are willing to take the pain.
Yeah.
In terms of lower living standards, maybe having to wear 2 jerseys in winter at home rather than wandering around in a Hawaiian shirt and shorts. So I think it is extremely important, and there should be much better documentation of the deportations and what the Russians are actually trying to do in terms of collapse the Ukrainian state.
Yeah, and because there are actual investigators from, I believe, the International Criminal Court who have gone to Ukraine, like conducting that investigations, aren't they? And there's normally things like Bucha and places like that where no massacres have occurred. But you're right, it's a much more wider issue that needs to be catalogued, certainly for the future. And in terms of just what you say about the pain it's going to cause, I mean, I think we're seeing that with the footstepping of the German government trying to dance around, dance in the middle of the street, shall we say. But it certainly appears that way. And certainly they've been accused of it by their detractors. But I'm interested in your take.
Yeah, I mean, I spent 15 years of my life in Germany, so I can sort of comment to a certain extent on this. I mean, the government has been pretty weak. I mean, they started off with lots of sound and fury. They're going to have sanctions, and then industry starts complaining that they need Russian gas. There'll be job layoff, and from the founding of the Federal Republic until today, if you like, the sort of main pillar of state policy is you can't have high unemployment because that leads to the Third Reich. And extremism. So they will sacrifice any principle to try and avoid high unemployment. And we're seeing it here. So in many ways, there was a theory to explain what the West German or the Federal Republic of Germany was up until reunification, which was a semi-sovereign state. You could take that idea and call it the semi-democratic state, in the sense that while it allegedly adheres to various democratic values, there's only so far it's prepared to go. And in fact, this actually has been discussed in Germany. There was a very interesting television debate where a journalist from the Bild sighting was saying, well, it's typical Germany. We're just obsessed with ourselves and not looking at the wider picture. So it is a subject of public discussion. Interesting is that the one party which has come out and said Ukraine needs heavy weapons has been the Green Party. And they were actually, in a way, much more solid, I thought, when it came to Germany engaging in NATO operations outside the NATO area. Under Joschka Fischer, they were prepared to intervene in the Yugoslavian civil war, send German forces to other conflict zones. The problem is that the country is inherently risk averse. Yeah. And I think, particularly the German Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, has been very clear in saying, look, we need to send Ukraine heavy weapons. So Germany does have a linchpin role in all of this. I mean, the population themselves, I think, have been very good at taking Ukrainian refugees.
Yes, yeah.
Much better than the UK, which is just trying to sort of drag its feet and make it as impossible, as difficult as possible for people to come over. And again, it's been public pressure which has forced the government to relax
to what they have actually done. Yeah.
But when it comes to the UK, I mean, I think they've been very good at sending weapons because it's, in a way, it's an easy fix. And if you look at the kind of difficulties the Prime Minister's in, I mean, I don't want to say he's doing it because it's a distraction from Partygate, but obviously that's not going to be.
It's convenient timing, certainly.
Yeah, it's going to make it a more attractive option, shall we say?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, go on, sorry.
Yeah, so I mean, just a sort of final thought in the UK. I mean, I think the UK needs a much better long-term strategy. And one thing I would like to see is, just referring back to what we're talking about with the attack on the Ukrainian intelligentsia, if we think this is going to be a long war, and if you look at the Donbass thing, that's been rumbling on since 2014, I think we need to have, either in Europe or in the UK, a kind of free Ukrainian university, which is supported by the government, and we try and get, you know, members of the Ukrainian intelligentsia over to Britain, and they can basically you know, observe what's going on, communicate it, just preserve that, if you like, sort of key part of the state in a safe place for hopefully a moment when the Russians are forced out, or there's a regime change in Moscow and they decide, yeah, this was actually an appalling state, let's restore the borders.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Yeah, I mean, I say it was a classic thing to come out of World War II. Certainly, it was both the Soviets and the Germans implemented that policy of exterminating the intelligentsia. So yeah, I think that's a good idea. Certainly, do you think it's an option that Western universities should be opening up jobs for Ukrainian intelligentsia if they've got the right qualification?
Well, it's the worst moment possible to try and do that.
That's true,
because we're facing in UK universities a comprehensive spending review. The results of the Research Excellence Framework are due next month, and people in Whitehall are just going to throw themselves at the statistics and use them to try and basically shrink the university budget.
Right.
So I think this has to come from a very different place in terms of the financing of universities. I mean, if you think of all the exile governments in London during the Second World War, I think that's maybe a way of just communicating it to people. We need to have some kind of grouping just to preserve as much as possible of Ukrainian universities. I mean, it doesn't even have to be necessarily people who are working in Ukrainian universities. Just create that, if you like, island of resistance, and have people ready to go back when the time's right.
Yeah, I mean, because it all depends on what happens in the next. Really, I think I say the next few weeks. I think again, making predictions, it's almost impossible to know if you're going to be right. We are all just shooting in the dark, as you say. We'll stand in front of maps. I do. No, I don't want to say that, because last time I said it was going to be over quickly, I was badly wrong. You're probably right. It's probably going to end up dragging out as long as. Sorry,
I think it might come to some sort of provisional stalemate on some kind of provisional agreement.
Okay.
But obviously, if you're the Ukrainians, you don't really want to get into that space because you don't want to give up ways of territory to an evil dictatorship.
Yeah. I mean, I think the Ukrainians at the moment are extremely positive. And I do think they've got the bit between their teeth and they're thinking, we're going to get it all back, like as in Crimea, as everything. I don't know how viable that is, but who knows? There's increasing Western support, but it's good, but it's still limited. So
yeah, I mean, does the West have the staying power is a big question.
That is a good question. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, also, if you just look at the, you know, what's happened to the Ukrainian economy, but this again could be a factor which ends up propelling both Ukraine and Russia towards some kind of agreement, because the shortage of grain on the world market, China was one of the biggest importers of Ukrainian grain, and there's some problems in China at the moment with agriculture.
Yes. Problems all around in China, which don't get as much coverage as they probably should.
Yeah, so there are all kinds of, if you like, global strategic factors which could push the two sides towards some kind of agreement. And of course, the big question is, how ill is Putin, and when will he do the decent thing and die?
He's a stubborn guy. I suspect he's not that helpful.
That's right. Yeah. And of course, then the question is, if he was to drop dead tomorrow, who would take over from him?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is it. We have this vision, I think, in the West of get rid of Putin and the problem's done. That may occur. It may not.
I mean, I think the issue is that essentially you have a kind of KGB criminal government.
Yeah.
So the security services around Putin, they're the ones who are holding power. The oligarchs are kind of have a bit of power, but not as much as the security services, because they can go and arrest people.
Yeah, a surprising amount of the oligarchs are turning up dead in mysterious circumstances at the moment. There's been a few. They've been classed as murder-suicides, but with suspicious circumstances. So you're like, okay, well, I think the oligarchs those who are no longer useful are being removed from the equation, probably for what they know. But
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, maybe we could round things off by just
Sure.
talking a bit about the quality of commentary on the war so
Sure,
far.
definitely, yeah.
I mean, I've found there've been two standout commentators for me.
Mhm.
One is Mark Galeotti, who's a long time commentator on Russia and the Soviet Union. And I think he's produced some of the best commentary I've seen and read, because he's got a wider view than many of the sort of retired generals who just want to talk about, how many missiles.
Yeah.
He understands the wider implications of the conflict. The other person is, in fact, the great granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev, Nina Khrushcheva. Obviously, she's got a bit of family history with the Soviet Union and Russia. She's a professor in New York.
Oh, okay.
And her commentary, I think, has been very interesting. Some things she got completely wrong, but in terms of how the state functions, I think her commentary has been really pretty good.
Oh, okay. I'll have to check them out. I don't think I actually follow either of them, I must admit. Largely relying on OSINT online stuff personally for following the conflict. But yeah, as you say, for understanding the broader picture, people like that are invaluable. I'll have to have a look at them.
And we should just be happy that we have a free press and we can get information from all kinds of different sources, unlike in Russia.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Alaric. I think it's been a really interesting conversation. I hope everyone listening thinks so too. And hopefully we won't be doing this again, because if it all finishes in a week, we won't have to. Maybe we do a post-war roundup. But unfortunately, I suspect we will be doing this again at some point, probably in another 60 days, unfortunately.
Yeah, I would reckon that unless something very surprising happens, this will be rumbling on in some form or another. Yeah, but thanks for the invite, Ed. It's always good to be on this channel.
Yep, thank you very much.
Happy to offer my opinions.
Yeah, and I'm sure people will be very interested in them. Thanks, Alaric, and I'll speak to you again soon. Right, well, I guess we'll start. Okay. I haven't actually thought how to start this.
Well, I can start. It's good to be back on the channel, Ed. I'm a sort of commentator for a channel.
No, I'm leaving that in now. Pretty much, yeah. Okay.